James Lindsay, qui est Senior Vice President of the Council on Foreign Relations. Cette conférence est aussi organisée avec le soutien de l'ambassade des États-Unis, que je remercie pour avoir permis d'avoir effectivement James Lindsay ce soir sur un thème des plus chauds, si je puis dire, et des plus intéressants pour celles et ceux qui étudient les relations internationales et pas seulement. Mon nom est Frédéric Esposito, je suis enseignant au Global Studies Institute et je vais vous dire quelques mots avant de passer la parole à Guy Metton, président du Club suisse de la presse. So today the Trump administration is facing certainly a most urgent foreign policy crisis, with this real question is not whether there is a North Korea policy, rather it's whether the administration can implement its emerging policy, which is facing obstacles. Many of them, I think, are self-imposed. Earlier in the year, the administration tried a military-centric approach that unnerved our friends and allies who thought Washington was preparing for war. But that approach failed to intimidate the North Koreans, who seemed convinced Trump was bluffing, and response, for me, with threats of their own and by accelerating their missile program. The administration that wisely shifted to a more balanced approach, described as maximum pressure and engagement, that combine through rhetoric, increased sanctions, and a willingness to talk. But Washington also concludes that North Korea was not ready for serious negotiations, as we've seen. Accordingly, the administration's strategy was to compel Pyongyang to get serious by squeezing the regime, cutting off its sources of foreign exchange, impeding its ability to finance its weapon programs, hemming it diplomatically and pressuring it militarily. To change North Korea's course, the United States must convince Kim Jong-un that the stability of his regime may be at risk if he does not denuclearize. This approach seeks a challenge, what many see as the main purpose of North Korea's development of nuclear weapons, ensuring the survival and stability of the regime. The first shortcoming is whether the administration has the determination to do what it says it intends to do. To break with past approaches, the US administration should force Kim Jong-un to choose between nuclear weapons and survival, an approach that has never been tried. But compelling Kim to make that choice requires applying overwhelming pressure in the economic, trade, banking, political, diplomatic, human rights, military, cyber, and covert arenas. There are also calls for the administration to abandon the goal of denuclearization in favor of seeking restraints on parts of the North's nuclear weapons program, leaving the core elements of Pyongyang's nuclear threat in place. For the Trump administration, following ill-conceived advice in order to create the appearance of progress and the illusion of security will be a major mistake. To deal effectively with North Korea, the Trump administration must coordinate its policy among numerous US agencies, as well as bring allies, partners, and the international community on board. And what about China? For too long, the Trump administration hopes China will solve the problem. The administration seems unable to grasp that China's goal with respect to North Korea differ from those to the United States. Beijing values North Korean stability and the preservation of the regime more than it fears the implications of a nuclear arms. Beijing fears peninsular instability and the consequences of reunification under Seoul. China, therefore, has no interest in a US orchestrated maximum pressure campaign that could bring about exactly what China fears. So US foreign policy towards North Korea, because I talk more on North Korea, and Russia, needs clarification and analysis. By chance, we have our expert tonight to make this more, certainly more understandable, I hope, and perhaps to clarify the US foreign policy and as such some of the foreign policy of US allies. So before to leave the floor to our specialist and colleague, James Lindsay, we'll leave the floor to Guy Metton, the president of the Geneva Club Press. Thank you.
Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Merci Stéphane. J'aimerais aussi remercier l'Université de Genève, la mission des États-Unis et Fonds pour avoir organisé cette soirée et nous avoir associés, nous, le Club Suisse de la Presse. So I would like also to thank our distinguished speaker tonight because Mr. Lindsay has a long record in American foreign relations since a few decades now. He was a member of the National Security Council in the 90s. He has taught at the Texas University. He has written many books about the American foreign policy, and I think we have the chance to get you tonight. I have a lot of questions to ask you. Maybe I just start with the first one. We will hear your statement, but before, for me, why America is so scared of Russia, which is 10 times less important in terms of defense expenses or economy, and about North Korea, which is maybe 100 times less also important than the United States. So, seen from Europe, we are astonished by this kind of fear. So we have the pleasure to hear you and after to manage the questions with our audience. So thanks again, Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you for that very kind introduction and letting me know what I'm in for tonight. Let me thank all of you for being so flexible in changing rooms. I'm glad we were able to move. I think this is a bit larger than the room we had before. Before I start, I have to do a couple of disclaimers. I am here speaking only on behalf of myself. I work for something called the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations is an independent, nonpartisan think tank in the United States. It takes no positions on any issues. The Council on Foreign Relations, it's not associated with the U.S. government. We take no money from the U.S. government. So I just wanted to sort of do that up front. Let me also sort of thank for us, the Swiss Press Club and the Global Studies Institute for having me here. I have this, or had this, very humbling title where I'm going to talk about Russia and North Korea and American foreign policy. And since we have a lot of people in the room, I suspect we have a lot of questions. And you'll probably have a better time if I don't use all of our time talking at you, and we can get sooner to questions. So I want to do 3 things in my conversation here tonight. One, I want to sketch out a little bit for you Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy, just some sort of general background. And then what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about this issue of North Korea. I will try to begin to answer your question. And finally, talk a little bit about Russia. Now, in doing that, almost by definition, I'm going to be sketching things out. I'm not going to be filling in everything within the lines. That'll be an opportunity for us to have a conversation. I'm happy to answer questions about American foreign policy writ large. I'm happy to answer questions about U.S.-Russia relations. We can talk about North Korea. We can talk about American domestic politics and how it is that Donald Trump won an election that nobody thought he was going to win. But let me begin first by talking about Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy. Donald Trump campaigned on a pledge to do things differently in foreign policy and to do different things. Let's just recall some of the things he said on the campaign trail. He insisted that after the Cold War, America's foreign policy veered badly off course. He called NATO obsolete, said he would happily tell its members, congratulations, you will be defending yourself. He suggested that Japan and South Korea should acquire their own nuclear weapons. He derided the European Union, saying that it had been formed to, quote, beat the United States on trade. He denounced American trade policy as catastrophic for the American economy. Indeed, he said he didn't see any trade deals that he liked. And I think significantly, he doubted that the United States should lecture others on democracy and human rights because, and I quote, I don't think we are a very good messenger. That's the message that Donald Trump, the candidate, broadcast. The long and short of that is Donald Trump's indictment of U.S. foreign policy was about how it has been practiced for several decades by both political parties. He wasn't saying the Democrats were better or Republicans were better. He said he was opposed to both. I think it's important to stress to people that Donald Trump did not come to these views, particularly on the issues related to trade, recently. This is not a case of a politician sort of hearing what the public wants to say and then saying it to them. You go all the way back to the 1980s, then private citizen Trump spoke very much in this vein. Second point I want to really make about the way Donald Trump approaches foreign policy is that he is not an isolationist, even though he's often described as one. Donald Trump is not interested in withdrawing America from the world as an isolationist would be. Donald Trump is interested in changing the terms of America's engagement in the world. That is, Donald Trump wants a foreign policy that puts America's narrow self-interest first. That is the essence of the policy of America First. It is a policy that is nationalist. It is a policy that is transactional. It argues for accepting who others are and not trying to change them. As befitting of a man who gave us a book entitled The Art of the Deal, the object of foreign policy is to get the best deals, not building the most durable relationships. And that's critical, for Donald Trump has no intellectual or sentimental attachment to multilateralism, to the liberal order that was created after World War II, or to transatlanticism. He believes, and said over and over again, America's allies, free ride off of its defense investments. The global trading system rips off America and costs Americans their jobs, and that democracy promotion and human rights are fool's errands, that money spent on those efforts abroad are better spent at home. I want to be very careful here. None of this is to argue that Donald Trump came to these views after long, deep reflection and pondering over the issues of world politics. The president is very proud of the fact that he doesn't go out and listen to experts. He operates on the basis of his gut and his instinct. He is a man who, I think it's fair to say, often thinks that complex problems have simple solutions. That's certainly the image he broadcast on the campaign trail. So what has happened coming into the White House? I think the president has discovered that revamping U.S. foreign policy, or if I may borrow a word popular in Silicon Valley, disrupting American foreign policy is harder to do than it seems when you're on the campaign trail. Yes, the president has withdrawn the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is a major trade deal involving many countries in and around the Pacific Rim. He withdrew the United States, or signaled the United States would withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. He has certainly, we heard in the introductory remarks, rattled allies in Europe with his at least initial reluctance to endorse Article 5 of the NATO treaty. His Twitter habits, I think, have also alarmed people around the world with his threats of trade wars and his habit of venting his displeasure at various people on Twitter. He has certainly aggressively enforced U.S. immigration law, and democracy promotion and human rights have really fallen down the listed priorities in American foreign policy. But that said, Donald Trump has not moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. He hasn't torn up the Iran nuclear deal. He hasn't imposed 35% tariffs on China, or declared China a currency manipulator, or abandoned the one China policy, or pulled U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, or taken the United States out of the North America Free Trade Agreement. This is a major agreement between the United States and Canada and Mexico. Those are all things that he promised to do and do essentially immediately upon becoming president. Why is that? Why is it that on actually policies ranging from Afghanistan to the Islamic State to North Korea, a point I'll come back to, his policies look pretty familiar to Barack Obama's in substance, even if the rhetorical packaging has been changed. This is partly because the president discovered, as many presidents discovered beforehand, issues that seem simple on the campaign trail are complicated in practice. One of the general rules of American politics is campaigns are about making promises. When you make promises, you can brush aside complexity. When you govern, governing is about choices. Choices are about acknowledging and wrestling with complexity. But the main impediment the president has discovered in terms of enacting his vision for American foreign policy is that the presidency is not as powerful as he himself imagined. Now, Trump initially populated his foreign policy team with people like Steve Bannon, who I presume you've heard of, General Michael Flynn, who were people who shared his nationalist, America First foreign policy agenda. Those people and people below them who shared those views are no longer in the administration. If you look at President Trump's foreign policy team, it's dominated by what I would call traditional foreign policy types, people who you could imagine having served in a previous U.S. presidential administration. Indeed, several of them have. Now, these traditionalists have been dubbed by some people as the axis of adults, or the Committee to Save America. People who invoke those phrases are people hoping that these traditionalists will sort of corral President Trump, make him a more conventional, traditional type president. People who want to let Trump be Trump, so to speak, refer to these people as globalists. So if you read the American press, that's what that refers to. So you think about traditionalists in the administration, you're thinking people like Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. Many people in Congress are also quite hesitant and wary of the new foreign policy that President Trump has promised. We're going to get a little bit more in a moment about U.S. relations with Russia, but this summer the United States Congress passed a bill tightening sanctions on Russia, making it harder for the president to do what he had promised to do over the course of the campaign, which was to reset or to seek to reset U.S. relations with Russia. It's remarkable that they did this because if you follow American politics, you might have noticed the United States Congress has a hard time passing legislation. Here, Congress not only passed legislation, it passed it by such a large margin that the president knew that if he vetoed the bill, the U.S. Constitution provides the option for presidents to refuse to sign legislation, that Congress had the votes to pass it over that veto. Okay? So here's an institution that has trouble getting agreement on this issue about how to deal with Russia, who had near unanimity. And just last week, a very important Senate committee passed a bill out of committee that rejected the budget cuts that President Trump has proposed, quite steep budget cuts, to America's foreign policy agencies, particularly the U.S. State Department. And quite significantly, what the committee said in having its vote, in its report, it is said that the president was proposing was a doctrine of retreat. Now, I've been following American foreign policy for a very long time. I can't remember any other time where a Senate or a House, any congressional committee, controlled by the president's own party, produced a report denouncing what the president was supposed to do. So what you're seeing in the United States is considerable pushback from people who don't like what President Trump is trying to do. Likewise, you have considerable pushback from America's allies. I can go through a whole list of issues. Let's just take one. Tariffs on steel. The Trump administration wanted to impose tariffs on steel because of the argument that the Chinese are dumping steel in the international market. A variety of countries, most notably France, Germany, Brazil, Japan, South Korea, made it clear that that would harm their interests and they would be very quick to retaliate. So there's a lot of pushback to President Trump's foreign policy. Now, we can talk about to what extent President Trump has been tamed by his advisors and by events in other countries. I think the convention of wisdom in Washington right now is perhaps he has been. I wouldn't be so sure, again, because the president's views on these issues are so deeply felt. And I think going forward, there are several issues where the president is likely to make decisions that have caused great upset among some allies. I think the one most immediate will be the issue of the Iran nuclear deal. The president has signaled that he does not believe Iran is complying with the Iran nuclear deal. It is clear that he is unhappy with his administration, that it has not provided him a basis in which he can get out of the deal. Watching mid-October, that's when the president is required under U.S. law to certify whether or not Iran is in compliance with the deal. Okay, this is something he has indicated he is not going to be willing to do. That obviously will create a significant rift with America's allies here in Europe. Okay, that's the big picture. Let's talk about Russia. Okay, the president wanted to have a reset with Russia. The president has talked fondly about Russian President Vladimir Putin. The president indicated when he came into office he was going to lift sanctions or relax sanctions, or see if it was possible to find a way to relax sanctions and improve U.S. relations with Russia. That has not come about. It has not come about for a very powerful and perhaps obvious reason. That is, the U.S. intelligence community has concluded unanimously across all 17 agencies that the Russians interfered in the U.S. election, that they were involved in pilfering emails from the Democratic National Committee, and were engaged in a lot of other operations that we refer to as information warfare. And the president's refusal to acknowledge the conclusions of the American intelligence community has been a very sore spot in American politics. And it's not likely, and we haven't seen any movement by the administration in the light of the hostility on Capitol Hill to his Russia proposals for any real diplomatic outreach. And by that same token, we haven't seen any overt moves by the Russians to alter their own behavior. And indeed, one does not have to be a cynic to believe that Russian President Putin has, in the conduct of his foreign policy, sought wherever possible to identify wedges that exist between the United States and its allies and to widen them. Now, during the introduction, it was noted that many Europeans can't understand why Americans are so threatened by Russia. Well, let me suggest that I would not use the word Europeans. Now, I have the great pleasure to visit many countries in Europe, and what you will find is Europeans don't agree on that. If you go to the Baltics, you go to Poland, elsewhere in Eastern Europe, you will find people who are greatly concerned about the conduct of Russian policy. greatly concerned that Russia intends to try to reimpose its influence over the region, that Russia is engaged in efforts to interfere in their elections, in the operation of their countries. And we may recall that those countries are members of NATO. And the United States, under Article 5, is responsible for participating in the common defense. So I don't think I would suggest that Europe is unified on that particular question. Now, let's talk North Korea, the other big issue. Why would the United States worry about North Korea getting nuclear weapons? The United States would worry about North Korea getting nuclear weapons for at least two reasons. Number one is that North Korea, as a nuclear armed power, would likely contribute to and accelerate global proliferation of nuclear weapons. For the past half century, the United States, and not just the United States, its European allies, its allies elsewhere, have fought a valiant effort to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. John F. Kennedy, when he was president back in the early 1960s, predicted that by the year 2000, at least 25, maybe 30 countries would have nuclear weapons. It turned out in 2000, the number was closer to 9. Why? Because of a concerted effort, not just by the United States, but by European countries, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and others, to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Very great concern here that the North Koreans will proliferate not just nuclear weapons, but also ballistic missile technology, the ability to deliver nuclear weapons over greater ranges. Second reason to worry about North Korea becoming a nuclear power. Let me step back a second. North Korea is a nuclear power. It has a nuclear weapons capability. It can deliver nuclear weapons against its allies, South Korea and Japan, both of whom are U.S. Treaty allies. It has the capability to hit the U.S. territory of Guam with missiles today. So North Korea has already crossed the nuclear Rubicon. It has done so in contravention to the UN Security Council, which has passed numerous resolutions saying that it should not proceed down this path. It has been the policy of the United States government across successive administrations, Democrat and Republican, that it would be unacceptable for North Korea to have nuclear weapons. Now, a North Korea that has not just nuclear weapons, but the ability to use them to hit cities in the United States is what's often referred to as a game changer in terms of not just regional but global politics. Why would it be a game changer? Again, I mentioned a moment ago, South Korea, Japan are both treaty allies of the United States. They have relied on the United States to be their ultimate security guarantor. The concern becomes if North Korea can jeopardize American cities, it can then hold off the United States and deter the United States from coming to the aid of its allies, South Korea and Japan. Now, some of you may think, well, but North Korea gets a nuclear weapon, it's just going to be for defensive purpose to make sure they don't get attacked. Perhaps. But I wouldn't be quite so sure that's their ultimate purpose. They could also use nuclear weapons essentially as a shield or a threat against the United States and to pursue a more aggressive policy against their southern neighbors, South Korea. And again, if you look at the track record of the regime in Pyongyang, it has a very disconcerting, concerning history. It is a country that blew up a plane containing more than 100 South Koreans in 1987. In 2010, it sank a South Korean naval ship. Just earlier this year, it assassinated the North Korean president's half-brother in Malaysia. It has conducted a variety of assassination campaigns around the world. It has kidnapped citizens of other countries and forced them into servitude. Okay, this is a country that has at times acted provocatively, aggressively, and the question is, if you're a decision maker who has decisions to make, are you prepared to live with a country that may act provocatively, that may, in essence, do things most other countries wouldn't do? And that's the challenge that Donald Trump faces. Let me close in a final point. That challenge that Donald Trump faces right now is one that Hillary Clinton would have faced if she had won last November 8th. Okay. Indeed, Barack Obama's parting message to Donald Trump was that North Korea was going to be the biggest and most immediate foreign policy problem that Donald Trump would face. So I think it is a grave error to suggest that North Korea is a problem today because Donald Trump is president. I'm going to stop here. We can have some questions. We can explore this issue or other issues and go from there.
Finished?
Yes, so we're, thank you. Yes, Swiss people are slow to react. So thank you so much for this first part. As you had a longer speech as you accepted.
Well, you asked me to talk for 20 minutes.
Exactly. This is perfect because I know there are many questions. So you will certainly add comments and analysis to what you say. So the role of the university, just raise your hand, short question. Also, introduce yourself very quickly. So we have a question in the back. Yes, gentlemen. Yeah, there's a microphone. Yeah, it's not working.
There is a microphone there. Yeah. So I was surprised because you finished so. But thank you for us. It's a better understanding of the domestic conditions of the American policy. Maybe I start with a question before to give the microphone. You speak with the first question. You speak about North Korea. So for you, what is the solution? It's war, it's bombing, or it's dialogue? Because there is not so many solutions to this kind of conflict.
So what is the choice set for the Trump administration? There are three possibilities, broad brush. Possibility number one is just to accept North Korea as a nuclear power. Option number two at the other end is to use military force to end North Korea's military program. And then obviously in the middle is some form of negotiated settlement that would give the United States assurance about the future of North Korea's nuclear program. And let me suggest that each of those options has a significant downside. Okay? This is not a case in which there's one answer that is blitheringly obvious. Okay, this is a situation in which all of the options could turn out terribly in the future. Okay, let's walk through the most obvious one: the use of military force. Okay, now let's go back. This problem of North Korea has been on the foreign policy agenda, not just the American foreign policy agenda, for a very long time. The Japanese aren't happy about this. The South Koreans aren't happy about this. Indeed, a fair number of European capitals aren't happy about it. Everyone always confronted the reality, though, is this was a problem that you probably wouldn't want to use military force to resolve for a very simple reason. It's likely to lead to a very high number of casualties. North of the 38th parallel in North Korea, but also south of the 38th parallel. Seoul, city of somewhere between 10 and 25 million people, depending upon where you draw the boundaries, is within reach of conventional North Korean artillery shells. North Korea has an awful lot of artillery pieces. So if you were to conduct what we call war games about how this may play out, I don't know of anyone who thinks that the death toll would be low. You're talking a death toll that may go tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And now if you add in the ability to use nuclear weapons, obviously much higher. Okay, so not a very palatable choice, which is why through successive administrations, a military option hasn't been used. You might say, well, what if you stop short of military operation that's regime change, and you aim at just sort of destroying their weapon sites? Just take their weapons away from them, so to speak. Got a couple of problems. One is you have to be pretty sure you know where all of those sites are. Two, you have to be pretty sure, if you know where those sites are, that you can actually destroy them. Okay? A little bit of a history lesson. Go back to the early 1980s. The Iraqis were pursuing nuclear weapons. They built a nuclear reactor. It was above ground. The Israelis blew it up. Well, what was the lesson everybody else took from that? Don't build things above ground that are easy targets. Build them underground to make it much harder to do. Okay? You also have a real problem in any sort of military attack, particularly where there's nuclear material, that you will end up putting fallout into the air. In the 1990s, the Clinton administration, when we first learned that North Korea was breaking international law in its pursuit of nuclear weapons, seriously considered attacking a nuclear reactor in North Korea. The conclusion was if you did that, you were going to produce a fair amount of fallout. It was going to drift over Japan. Not an appealing set. So you look at the set of military options, they are not encouraging. Go to the flip side. Well, why don't you just live with it? I outlined some of the responses or concerns people would have. Number one, if you say just live with it, you should only say that if you're going to say to yourself, okay, I believe that the North Koreans are deterrable. If you don't believe they're deterrable, then you presumably don't want to live with it because you're afraid they're going to use it. Okay? But there's a series of other questions you have to ask yourself. Number one, if you decide to live with it now, will it be the case that you'll be happy where you are 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, as their capacity grows? Perhaps it just emboldens them to push the envelope a bit more to see what they can get. And again, part of this is, some people, when you have this discussion, make the assumption that they only want weapons for defensive purposes. Sort of once they have their status acknowledged, they won't bother anybody. But what if they're a risk-prone regime, not a risk-averse regime? Okay? Then you may, in essence, have a bigger problem tomorrow than you have today. Likewise, you have the problem of proliferation. Okay? And let's sort of think about it. If North Korea has a growing nuclear arsenal, South Korea can then ask themselves, South Koreans can ask themselves, can we count on the Americans to be our security guarantor? And you may answer, no. South Korea may decide it wants to get nuclear weapons. Japan, which has a very large taboo against nuclear weapons because of its history being the only country to have had them used against them, may also make a similar decision. That obviously matters to China. It also matters to Russia. You have the potential for a significant arms race in Northeast Asia. Okay? You also have one other problem that often goes under the radar, and it's a problem that people in the arms control strategic weapons community call the problem of crisis instability. If you go back to the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, sort of at the bottom, had very large arsenals. Both sides knew that regardless of who went first, the other would have enough weapons left over to retaliate. It made going first not worthwhile. It's summed up in the phrase, mutual assured destruction. Right? The logic there is, you don't want to, there's no incentive to go first because it's not going to help you out. You're not going to end up being appreciably better off. Mutual assured destruction is not likely to characterize the situation with North Korea. That is, North Korea is going to run the risk that the United States can take out its nuclear weapons before North Korea fires. Think about that situation in which, unless you go first, you will lose your weapons, okay? On an average day, that might not bother you, okay? In the middle of a crisis, tensions are rising, calculations become very different. And so you have the potential that you could have the exact outcome you're trying to avoid because of what people believe is going to happen. Okay? There's a tendency to look at government decision-making, think everything is rational, fully informed by information. But oftentimes you get into crisis situations, people do not have complete information, people make guesses about what is going to happen, and you could create a situation we call crisis instability, in which the incentives are pointing exactly the direction you don't want them to go.
Thank you for the answer. Maybe last question before to give you the floor about President Donald Trump. Because if I understood you correctly, you said he's not an isolationist. It's different. But seen from Europe, we have this impression that he is a kind of isolationist. And secondly, that he's a little bit idiot, if I can say. He's not rational, he's not, a bit chaotic. But could you tell us more about him, about his team, what is his agenda? Because I have the impression we don't understand correctly his agenda and what he tries to do.
Okay.
And
fair enough. I don't think the president's an idiot. And I think he could fairly point out that everyone doubted he could become president of the United States, and he did. And I do think it is the case that the president has very strong views, especially on issues like trade policy, deep-seated skepticism on issues like the benefits of multilateralism, something I think for many people in Europe is just seen as obvious. And that guides his decision-making. Again, his worldview is that America's allies have taken advantage of it. Argues that too many American jobs have been lost because of bad trade deals, and the United States has no business telling other people how to live, and we're not particularly good at it. Okay, but he's not an isolationist. I mean, he's very different, let's say, from Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, one of the men that President Trump beat in winning the Republican nomination, eventually winning the White House. He's willing to use military force abroad. He's not talking about removing American military bases from overseas. So it's a very different sort of approach. I would also add, looking at Donald Trump in his critique of how America's allies have behaved toward the United States, that he could turn around and point, in fact has, I'm not the first leading American to say that our allies haven't done their fair share. I'm not the first American to say that our allies aren't doing enough. He can go back and point to Barack Obama, who said the same thing. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates can go back to the Bush administration. He can go back a fairly long time. Now, what Donald Trump would say, American presidents have been complaining about European commitment to the common defense for a very long time, and the result has been European spending on defense has continued to go down. Now, some people say the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. So why shouldn't I, as a president, say, you made a pledge. You're not even living up to your own pledge. If you're not invested in your own defense, your own security, why should we? And I think that is his argument, and it has a great resonance with a lot of Americans.
Okay. Thanks. So, a lot of questions. You first, I think. Bon, ok, madame, on va commencer derrière. Okay.
Yes, thank you for your time tonight. I just wanted to ask about Turkey. With what's happening in Syria right now, the fact that President Erdogan just announced that Turkey would buy Russian-made missiles, that is very frowned upon by NATO. What is the play there for both Russia and the US? Thank you.
What is the play there for Russia? Very obviously, President Putin, as I mentioned before, very much would like to drive wedges wherever he can in NATO and in Europe and the European Union, the transatlantic relationship. He hasn't made much attempt to hide that. Indeed, he's tried to do the same thing in East Asia. He was in Vladivostok meeting with President Moon I guess a little over a week ago. With jet lag, I'm sort of a little bit off on what day it is, but basically making the same point. Are you sure you want to really be associated with the Americans? It's going to cause you a lot of problems. You know, maybe you want to go in a different direction. And again, you know, it's easy to understand his objectives and why it exists. He has said that he regards the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical mistake of the 20th century. He wants to reclaim what Russia once had. And while you are right that, from your opening remarks, that Russia economically is a small country, it also has one of the largest nuclear arsenals, and more important, it has visions of itself as a global power that is going to involve itself. Now, it doesn't have the capacity, for the reasons you point out, to be a positive influence in many instances, and it largely acts as a spoiler. Okay, and so I think that's important to keep in mind. The play for the United States, it's a really difficult one, because the United States is caught between competing friendships, competing values, competing interests. If you look at the government of Recep Erdogan, you have a man who has taken Turkey away from democracy, not toward it. That trend was in evidence before the failed coup a little over a year ago. It's become more pronounced since then. Crackdown on sort of the everyday freedoms people here we take for granted. Turkey is going in the wrong direction. Turkey also happens to be a member of NATO. It's an important member of NATO just given its geography. It's an important country, even more so for Europe, given the issue of Syria, refugee flows, the agreement between the European Union and Turkey about how to deal with some of those refugee flows. And so for the United States, is also trying to work with, in Iraq. Now we're going to have a referendum coming up in Iraqi Kurdistan. Now perhaps the Turks can live with an independent Iraqi Kurdistan. However, the Turks are very unhappy about Kurds in Syria, which happen to be American supported in the American effort to combat the Islamic State. So you can begin to see there are cross-cutting pressures and conflicting impulses here. Obviously, if you are Vladimir Putin, if you can bring Turkey closer to Russia, that's a big geopolitical win for you. Conversely, if you are President Erdogan and you're playing a game of realpolitik, stepping closer to Russia is going to make Europe and the United States a bit more nervous, may give you leverage to extract concessions from them on issues you care about. Maybe it's don't criticize me for my human rights abuses or strangling of democracy in Turkey, or maybe it's to get a better trade deal or something else. But it's a very complicated system, and it's not obvious what the play is.
Thanks. Question.